Welcome to Groups This Week. As a church, we exist to help all people become fully devoted followers of Jesus. We believe doing life together is a crucial part of that journey. During this time, we're going to unpack and dig deeper into the sermon we heard this past week. Let's dive in as we continue to grow in our faith, knowledge, and love of Jesus together. Well, hey, and welcome community groups, and a happy Thanksgiving to those of you who celebrated this past weekend, which is really fitting because we talked about generosity across all of our campuses and gratitude a little bit too this past weekend.
Yeah. You know, interesting thing, Ryan, about Thanksgiving, I kind of dug into the origins of it, and it was January 31st, 1957. The Governor General of Canada, Vincent Massey, declared a day of general thanksgiving to Almighty God for the bountiful harvest He's given Canada. And so there is some Christian origins with this kind of Thanksgiving holiday.
No way.
Yeah, and I think it does set up our topic of in Compelling Community on generosity today, because I think that generosity is a response to a generous God. Generosity is a response to a generous God. And so in light of all that God has given us, who He is, and all the things that He's just richly given us, we now respond in just with generous hearts, with generous hearts.
Yeah. Tell me more about that, man.
Yeah. And so I think generosity, the starting place is not necessarily a commandment, but I think it's actually a mindset. And so if we see the world as a world where there is a creator God who is generous, benevolent being, in whom life and breath and everything comes from, who cares for the birds and the flowers, who cares for you and for me, that He's a God who provides for me, and everything that I own has actually come from Him. If this is our mindset, like more of a abundance mindset, then we are actually going to be generous people. But if our mindset is this, God doesn't exist, or if He does, He doesn't care, the world is overpopulated, resources are hard to come by, I don't have enough, I won't have enough, I need to save every penny and keep all these things to myself. If that's our mindset, the way that we view the world, then what's going to be the natural overflow? Rather than this, it's going to be like this, mine, right? Yeah.
Well, it really is interesting how our beliefs and our thinking shapes our behaviors and the way that we live, and definitely true in how we view our resources and what we do with them. So with that mindset that you're talking about, are there any examples you can think of just, throughout church history where Christians have lived that out?
Yeah. Well, I think this was actually a part of what made the early church and the church throughout the ages actually so compelling, is the fact that because of who they believe God to be, they lived a life of generosity. And we see this all throughout the Bible. Acts chapter 2, 44 to 45, it shows how the believers shared their possessions and made sure that anyone who was in need was taken care of. And we see that right at the book of Acts, right at the origins of the church. We see in chapter 4 that they care for the needy. And it highlights how the apostles actually distributed the proceeds from sales of land and possessions so that nobody had lack amongst them. And we see the same thing happen in Acts 11, where the church of Antioch, after hearing a prophetic word, I found this really interesting. I read Acts before, but it hit me yesterday. They hear this prophetic word that a famine is coming to Jerusalem, and they respond to that prophetic word by taking an offering to send to Jerusalem in advance before the famines even started.
That's faith, eh?
Yeah, totally. It's just super cool. And we also see that they supported gospel advancement. And we actually see Paul, who was a church planter, commend the Philippian church for their generosity towards him, that even though he wasn't with them, they kept sending money to him so that he could go and plant churches in different regions and different places. And he was just so thankful for that. And so, we see just example after example in the book of Acts. And this continued throughout church history. In fact, Julian the Apostate noted how Christians, and he called them pious Galileans, how they cared for not only their poor, but also the poor of the Greeks and the Romans also. And he was writing to like pagan temple leaders, and he's saying, guys, they're making us look bad here.
I've heard this story.
Yeah.
Wow.
And in the words of David Wood, he said, Julian the Apostate is writing to these pagan leaders, and he basically says, get your butts back in the city and start helping the poor. These Christians are making you look bad. Yeah.
Showing us up.
Yeah. So.
Wow. That's a lot of evidence, Cam.
Totally,
Christians being generous. And I mean, it totally makes sense if that is the mindset we have, that we have a generous God who has blessed us with so much, and therefore we are blessed to be a blessing to others. Now, those are kind of some theological, maybe, underpinnings in this whole conversation, but are there actually like even any practical reasons for being generous?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I think just on a practical level, there's some really interesting social science behind this, that people actually tend to be happier. So like their joy level goes up, healthier. So their health is better, they live longer, and they even laugh more when they're generous. Studies show that generosity actually activates this part of our brain that is the same when we're experiencing intimacy or sharing like a really great meal with someone. It's like, it's that same sensor of the brain of saying like, this is really good. This is what I'm meant to do, Yeah.
It's almost like Jesus meant it when he said it's more blessed to give than receive, hey?
Totally.
We're blessed in that through some of these findings.
Absolutely.
Psychologically and scientifically.
Absolutely.
Well then, Cam, like what do you think is like the call to respond? Whether that's tithing, like what does it look like for us as a church to be generous?
Yeah, for sure. I think this is the point where all of you are sitting on the edge of your seat. You're like, okay, here comes the tithing pitch. He's going to ask me for money, right? And, here's the truth, is that tithing, I think it's good in principle.
Totally.
But I actually do believe it to be an Old Testament ethic. So tithing, just for those of you who didn't know, it's giving 10% of your income to God or to the church. And we do see this principle in the Old Testament, as well as a bunch of other things that, were a much larger percent than 10% that we were supposed to give to the church in different initiatives. But I think the New Testament ethic is actually one of radical generosity. And John Mark Comer was talking about this in a recent series that he was talking about generosity, is that sometimes I think tithing, this 10% that we put over people's heads, for those who are really struggling financially, it is actually like an incredibly heavy burden on their shoulders, where they're like, I don't know how I'm going to do this. This is so difficult. And then those who actually have like a ton of means, it puts this really easy low bar cap for their generosity on it, right? And so I think the New Testament, and we see this in the life of the early church, actually just calls people to this radical generosity that maybe to you and I, as we read it, seems a little bit unhinged, a little bit bizarre, like there's no way they actually live that way. But they gave up their possessions. They gave up anything extra to support those around them that were in need. And I think this is what we're called to as well, is to trust God and to, rather than asking ourselves the question, am I giving 10%? It's asking ourselves the question, I want you to ask yourselves this question, am I being radically generous with what God has given me?
Dang.
I think that's what will make us a compelling community. It's not when we're like, okay, check, I've given a certain amount. It's when people look at our lives and they go, wow, that person is radically generous.
Dang, that's something worth chewing on. And that's big. Generosity is the wider umbrella, which maybe tithing is a part of. I think I agree with you, that's God's heart is generosity, not necessarily a percentage, right? And so it looks different for people depending on their situation. I was listening to the same podcast, I think you were as well, with Comer, and I was struck by a line that I think it was saying like, perhaps the question we should be asking isn't how much should I give, but how much should I keep as a Christian? And it's like, okay, that definitely flips like the mindset, right? So I mean, really challenging, but generosity mindset versus scarcity mindset, like you're talking about.
That's incredible.
I think we've got a lot to learn and talk about in this whole conversation. So we'll maybe send it to you as a group And thanks so much, Cam, for sitting down with us. But have a great conversation.
Yeah. Have a good week, guys.
We hope you enjoyed the teaching today. If you're wanting to follow along with our community group's discussion guide with your group, you can head to cachurch.ca/media, where you can find the discussion guide. Not only are there questions there related to the sermon, but there's also prayer prompts that relate to the passage or the topic that we were talking about, and practices that you can, on an individual level or a group level, begin integrating into your life to not only bring this knowledge into your mind, but to begin living it out.